So 60 years ago today, we've got, hold on, I've got to move this around a little bit. There we go. 60 years ago today, the first human being went into space. Now that's just cool to think about. You know how I love space. I'm all about space. And this man was the first man to go to space. First human. I don't know if people get upset about whatever. I don't care. He's the first man to go to space. This is awesome. Yuri Gagarin. If you don't know about him, you should. You know, it's like it was this U.S. versus Russia. Who's going to, Sputnik. They started with Sputnik and they got it out there. And then all of a sudden, Americans were like, they're spying on us. We got to get into space. And it was the space race. And, it became this race. But I'm looking at it like this is the first man to space. Like this guy's, it's pretty inspiring. So let's read about him. So he was the first person to fly in space. His flight on April 12th, 1961 lasted 108 minutes as he circled the Earth for a little more than one orbit in the Soviet Union's Vostok spacecraft. And I actually have an image of that. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. This is cool. This is basically it. He was by himself. Look how cool that thing is. This is dope. All right, so let's see. There's Yuri there. He's got three portholes to view. Let's see, we got some hatches, a TV camera. Look at that camera. That's basically it. It was just like him and a camera. Ejection seat blast cosmonaut out of the capsule before landing. That's right. They didn't have landing gear on this thing. He actually was rocketed out of it and just landed with a parachute. So he kind of did a skydive. So really interesting. All right, let's get back to the article here. Following the flight, Gagarin became a cultural hero in the Soviet Union. Even today, more than 6 decades after the historic flight, Gagarin is widely celebrated in Russian space museums, with numerous artifacts, busts, statues displayed in his honor. And I have just a few pictures, murals, and I'm going to show you them all in a second. There's so many. This dude is idolized, rightly so. It's pretty amazing. It's the first human being to go into space that we know about, right? I'm just let's see here. His remains are buried at the Kremlin in Moscow, and part of his spacecraft is on display at the RKK Energia Museum. Gagarin's flight came at a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were competing for technological supremacy in space. The Soviet Union had already sent its first artificial satellite, called Sputnik, into space on October 1957. Before Gagarin's mission, the Soviets sent a test flight into space using a prototype of the Vostok spacecraft. During this flight, they sent a life-size dummy called Ivan Ivanovich and a dog named Zvezdacha. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Probably not, but that's all right. Into space. After the test flight, the Soviets considered the vessel fit to take a human into space. All right. Now, before I continue on there, I have to bring this up. It was so before Yuri. I mean, yes, Yuri was the first human, but before Yuri, there was actually another living thing that we sent, and it was a dog. And I want to give it its due. I know it's a little different, but this is Laika. The dog was the first living creature to be launched into Earth orbit on board the Soviet artificial satellite Sputnik 2, November 3rd, 1957. It was always understood that Laika would not survive the mission, but her actual fate was misrepresented for decades. All right, fair warning. This is sad. This is a sad story. I feel for this dog. I think this is actually rather terrible. And it's I don't know. Some people try to make it okay that it was fine. I don't know. It's a terrible story. I love dogs. I love animals in general. Animals are amazing creatures. And this dog was a mutt on the street, and they gathered a bunch of other mutts and brought him in. And she happened to be the right kind of temperament, size. They chose a female dog over a male dog because they just they said that I don't know, they were better accustomed to a small habitat, and they trained her to eat jellied food. Interesting. They spun her in a centrifuge to get her accustomed to changes in gravitation. And when the launch was announced, Laika became an international celebrity. The satellite and its passenger soon acquired the journalistic nickname of Muttnik. All right, we'll give you that. It's pretty good because it was a mutt. So the accounts implied the dog was kept alive for 6 to 7 days into the mission and then euthanized with poisonous food before her oxygen supply ran out. That's what they claimed for a long time. But it actually turned out the satellite was destroyed, re-entering the Earth's atmosphere in April 14th, 1958. But it's actually come out later on that they had her hooked up to heart rate so they can find out what her heart rate was. And just on taking off and getting into space, she died in basically the taking off. And this was not until 2002 that they actually released this information. So it's pretty sad. Like this, they sent a dog and she died on the way out into space. And I guess she was in space before passing out and passing on. So I just I think it's a terrible thing to do to a dog. Any animal that doesn't understand what's happening, it's a sad thing. And I don't know. Even Yuri became later on in his life, after he took his first flight, they basically barred him from flying again because he was too much of a hero. They didn't want to risk losing him. He was supposed to fly in the Soyuz 1, and he even said, "It's not ready. It's not ready. You need better safety checks. I could tell you right now that this isn't right." And in fact, it wasn't. And the original pilot actually passed on. I'm not sure if it blew up or not, but I guess I'm jumping around. Let's get back to Yuri. So back to Yuri, the third of 4 children, Yuri Gagarin. I don't even know, Alexeyevich Gagarin. Maybe I said it. Seemed all right. Was born March 9th, 1934. That's Tim's birthday, actually, in a small village 100 miles from Moscow. As a teenager, Gagarin witnessed a Russian Yak fighter plane make an emergency landing near his home. When offered a chance years later to join a flying club, he eagerly accepted, making his first solo flight in 1955. Only a few years later, he submitted his request to be considered as a cosmonaut. More than 200 Russian Air Force fighter pilots were selected as cosmonaut candidates. Such pilots were considered optimal because they had exposure to forces of acceleration and the ejection process, as well as experience with high-stress situations. Gagarin, a 27-year-old senior lieutenant at the time, was among the pilots selected. On April 12th, 1961, at 9:07 a.m. Moscow time, the Vostok 1 spacecraft blasted off from the Soviets' launch site. Because no one was certain how weightlessness would affect the pilot, the spherical capsule had very little in way of onboard controls. The work was done either automatically or from the ground. If an emergency arose, Gagarin was supposed to receive an override code that would allow him to take manual control. But Sergei Korolev, chief designer of the Soviet space program, disregarded protocol and gave the code to the pilot prior to the flight. Over the course of the 108 minutes, Vostok 1 traveled around the Earth once, reaching a maximum height of 203 miles. The spacecraft carried 10 days' worth of provisions in case the engines failed, and Gagarin was required to wait for the orbit to naturally decay. But the supplies were unnecessary. Gagarin re-entered Earth's atmosphere, managing to maintain consciousness as he experienced forces up to 8 times the pull of gravity during his descent. Vostok 1 had no engines to slow its re-entry and no way to land safely. About 4 miles up, Gagarin ejected from the spacecraft and parachuted to Earth. In order for the mission to be counted as an official spaceflight, the Federation Aeronautique International, FAI, the governing body of aerospace records, had determined that the pilot must land with the spacecraft. Soviet leaders indicated that Gagarin had touched down with the Vostok 1, and they did not reveal that he had ejected until 1971. Regardless, Gagarin still sets the record as the first human to leave Earth's orbit and travel into space. I think so. Does it matter that he didn't land with the spacecraft? I mean, if they weren't sure how it was going to land, I'm pretty happy that he was able to eject out of there and survive. Yeah. Anyway, upon his return to Earth, Gagarin was an international hero. A cheering crowd of hundreds of thousands of people greeted him in Red Square, a public plaza in Moscow. A national treasure, Gagarin traveled around the world to celebrate the historic Soviet achievement. When he returned home, Gagarin became a deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, the highest legislative body in the Soviet Union, and was appointed commander of the cosmonauts detachment. Because the Soviets did not want to risk losing such an important public figure, they were hesitant about allowing Gagarin to return to space. He continued to test flights for the Air Force, however. On March 27, 1968, Gagarin was killed, along with another pilot, while test piloting a MiG-15, a jet fighter aircraft. He was survived by his wife, Valentina Ivanovna Goyachev, terrible with these Russian names, apologies, and 2 of his daughters. NASA's Apollo 11, the first mission to put people on the moon, landed in July 1969, and the crew left behind a commemorative medallion bearing Gagarin's name. They also left medallions of other astronauts who lost their lives in space or while preparing for spaceflight, which there were many. And so this is actually quite a long article that goes into the rest of spaceflight. It doesn't really talk much more about Yuri, but this man was so loved. I mean, he is still on murals all over Russia. I mean, you could just, and he's got busts in parks. They worship this guy. And you could just see, like, there's murals all over the place. And he was always smiling. He was always happy. Supposedly that they were always very, he was just a very, this is a rare picture of him not smiling, because most things that you see of him, he's smiling. You can see here, you can see it. It's probably in that museum they referenced earlier. And yeah, I mean, there are just countless images of him all over Russia. I mean, he's, you know, they're very proud of this, you know. So on anniversary, this is from today. Putin actually says Russia must remain a space power. Now let's read about this. He called on Monday for Russia to remain a great power in space as the country celebrated the 60th anniversary of the legendary flight that made Yuri Gagarin the first person in orbit. Russia's space industry has struggled in recent years and been hit by a series of mishaps, but the sending of the first human into space on April 12, 1961 remains a major source of national pride. After visiting a memorial in southern Russia at the site where Gagarin landed after his 108-minute trip around the Earth, Putin told his government to do more to maintain Moscow's position in space. In the 21st century, Russia must maintain its status as a nuclear space power, Putin said in a televised remarks. We will analyze the needs to be done to what needs to be done to strengthen our position in this strategic industry, he said, noting that the space program is directly related to national defense. Putin called for a review of major projects and a new space development strategy over the next, or at least 10 years. The day of Gagarin's flight is celebrated every year in Russia as Cosmonautics Day, and this year authorities pulled out all the stops to mark the 60th anniversary, with around-the-clock television coverage, murals on high-rises, and laser projections of Gagarin's portrait. For Moscow commuters, the morning started with a broadcast on the metro of the original report by state news agency TASS about the launch, followed by Gagarin's legendary words, Pekali, let's go. He straight up went to space and said, let's go. I love that. I love that. That is awesome. As his Vostok spacecraft lifted off, let's go to space. Come on. That's pretty awesome. All right, let's continue. In a message from the International Space Station, the 4 Russians on board saluted all Earthlings and hailed Gagarin's accomplishment. All Earthlings. I like that. Gagarin's legendary 108-minute flight became an example of heroism for his successors, including us, said cosmonaut Oleg Novitsky. Vostok took off carrying Gagarin, he was 27 at the time, son of a carpenter and dairy farmer, from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, then part of the Soviet Union. And then, of course, we've kind of went over this. He landed in a potato field in front of a 5-year-old girl, Rita Nurskanova, and her grandmother. How cool would that be? You're sitting in a potato field. Life probably is pretty boring out in the middle of Russia somewhere. Maybe Kazakhstan. Yeah, it was Kazakhstan. And, you're just with your grandma, just... what are you checking the potato fields, seeing everything's good? You look up and there's just like this man floating down from the sky, landing in front of you wearing a spacesuit. It's got to be amazing. That's got to be amazing. Anyway, so yeah, Russia is obviously trying to get back in. I mean, they took a hit from SpaceX last year. Basically, took over. They had a monopoly on bringing astronauts to the International Space Station using the Soyuz rocket. And last year basically ended that. SpaceX had created the Dragon capsule, and now they have, Americans are flying into space from American soil again after a long time, and it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. So let's go. I love that so much. I don't know how to say this. Poikali. Pokali. I don't know how to pronounce it. Any Russian speakers out in chat know how to actually pronounce that word? Anyway, it's pretty cool. It's the first human into space. That should be celebrated everywhere. I mean, people should know about this guy because he's the first human being to go to space. We should celebrate that because that's an amazing achievement. Russia launching Sputnik, or the USSR, that spawned NASA. It started the space race. We're in space, and it set in motion everything as far as getting into space. We didn't think about it. Because they did it, we had to do it. So we had to, get it going.